painful day, coming back to a place that I love and respect so much, albeit virtually, but in these circumstances. And I've had plenty of time to reflect on what has happened. I welcome this inquiry and its related reviews, and I believe there are important lessons to be learned. It was the greatest honour of my life to be Prime Minister of this country. And when my service as Prime Minister came to an end, I wanted to build a new career based on a mix of charitable and pro bono work for causes that I care about, like dementia and international development, and business interests in areas of cutting-edge technology. I believe that an ex-Prime Minister should be able to do that, and I thought carefully about the choices I made and took extensive advice. As part of that range of activity, I would explain why I chose to work for Greensill Capital, the circumstances under which I contacted government ministers and others, and my motivations for doing so. I'd also explain how I abided by the rules that were in place. But rules alone are never enough. We learnt that in this place over so many issues: personal conduct and codes of behaviour, and how such conduct and behaviour both appears and can be perceived. These things matter too. I completely accept that former Prime Ministers are in a different position to others because of the office that we held and the influence that continues to bring. We need to think differently and act differently. Lobbying itself is a necessary and healthy part of our democratic process, but I accept there's a strong argument that having a former Prime Minister engage on behalf of any commercial interest, no matter how laudable the motives and cause, can be open to misinterpretation. Perhaps that's especially so when the communication systems we all use, particularly in the heat of responding to a crisis, are text, phone, and app, rather than the more formal approach of writing. I hope it is accepted that nothing I did was in breach of the rules, but on the wider test of what is appropriate, as I've said previously, it would be better only to use the most formal means of contact via a letter. I started working as a senior advisor to Greensill Capital in August 2018. Lex Greensill wanted me to help him grow what was becoming a successful UK-based fintech firm. There was geopolitical and strategic advice, helping with international expansion, speaking at customer and supplier events, and helping to win new customers. I liked the fact that the business was using technology and deep capital markets to help small businesses and supply chains to get low-cost credit, to get paid early. I had seen how this had worked in government when Lex Greensill was brought in by Jeremy Hayward to advise my administration from 2011, though at the time, as I've explained, I only met him very briefly. This was all part of the civil service drive to improve government efficiency. In bringing him in, Jeremy was acting in good faith to solve a real problem: how to ensure companies and supply chains, particularly SMEs, could access low-cost credit. In terms of my role, I was not employed at Greensill as a lobbyist, and lobbying the UK government was never intended to be part of my role. However, in the economic turmoil caused by COVID, the government quite rightly introduced several schemes to help ensure that credit would continue to be expanded to business. The Greensill proposal was to make this even more effective, and I believe that it should be considered by government. This was particularly the case as what was being suggested was very similar to action that had been taken during the financial crisis in 2008, in which businesses like Greensill had been involved. My motivation for contacting ministers and others was to help UK firms at this moment of difficulty and to ensure that fintech firms, and Greensill in particular, were listened to as well as the major clearing banks. My reason for contacting the Chancellor and others so directly was because these solutions were being considered, introduced and amended in rapid time, and I believe Greensill could help the country at this time of acute health and financial crisis. I knew that any meetings between Greensill and officials that were being asked for would, quite rightly, be publicly reported, not least because of the rules on transparency that I helped to put in place as Prime Minister. Greensill was not asking for direct government support or some sort of bailout. And at this stage, April last year, I certainly had no sense at all that the business itself was in any danger of collapse. Separately, in 2019, Greensill had decided to extend the idea of paying suppliers early to business's most important supplier of all, its workforce. I thought this was a very appealing idea. Allowing employees to draw down their salary as they earned it for free, rather than having to wait till the end of the month, seemed an effective way, amongst other things, to help end the scourge of payday lending. For firms in the private sector, while there'd be a charge for the employer, there would never be a charge for the employee. And in the public sector, it would be free for both employer and employee. I became an enthusiastic supporter of this new app, Earned it was called, and wanted to promote it to the NHS and other public sector bodies. I could see a profound social benefit from the take-up of this technology. I'm desperately sorry that Greensill and Earned went into administration. Hundreds of hardworking people have lost their jobs and many more are threatened by the consequences. As I was neither a director of the company nor involved in any lending decisions by the company, I have no special insight into what ultimately happened, but I'm as keen as anyone to learn the lessons and hope that these inquiries will help with that process. I know you're also examining the rules governing lobbying and business appointments after ministers and officials leave office, and any special arrangements for former prime ministers. And on that subject, I have these brief thoughts. The lobbying rules were put in place to deal with lobbying by multi-client firms rather than employees of individual businesses, to ensure that those being lobbied knew on whose behalf they were being contacted. This was, of course, backed by the fact of the existence of all relevant and subsequent meetings with businesses are then made public. If lobbying registration can be extended to in-house operatives without excessive bureaucracy or damaging the interests of charities, there is a case for making that change. The body that vets jobs for former ministers and civil servants, ACABA, is well established and in my view works, but its examination of appointments should be mandatory and comprehensive, and its decisions should be enforceable. As I said at the outset, former prime ministers are in a different category, and I've read the arguments for different special arrangements. A longer period before any contact with government over any commercial issue could be appropriate, and a new special committee over and above ACABA to advise on post office appointments might help with choices that need to be made. Can I thank you, Chair, for letting me make that opening statement?
Okay, thank you, David, for that. That did run over what we had agreed in terms of time, I have to say. And I think it's therefore, I wasn't intending to raise this, but I will as a consequence of that. We were allocated rather less time than we had asked your office for this session so that we could complete our scrutiny effectively. So I feel bound to ask you now, in the event that we don't get through this session, having fully scrutinized all the areas with you that we require to, could I have a commitment from you now that you will return to this committee to answer any subsequent questions we may have?
Well, of course, we've got, I think, 2 hours, and I'm very happy to start running the clock from now. So if that helps, I'm certainly happy to do that.
The question was, in the event that we don't get through everything, we had over 3 hours. In fact, that would be an hour less, I think, on average, compared to the other sessions we've had, including with Lex Greensill himself. So could I have a commitment that in the event that we don't get through everything today, you will come back and appear before us again?
Very happy to answer all the questions.
Good. Okay. Well, you, sorry, just so I'm very clear, when you say happy to answer all the questions, that is a yes to coming back to the committee if we request it.
Well, let's see how we get on. I'm sure we've got effectively till 5 o'clock, but if we haven't got through them, then of course we can do this again.
You see, I think the committee would justifiably expect a straight answer to that question as to whether
I've said if we don't get through it, then I'm very happy to come back again.
Okay, well, if I take that, therefore, unless you're going to contradict me, that if we don't get through it to the satisfaction of the committee, and we therefore invite you back, that you will come back and answer our further questions. Thank you very much. Thank you. Now, you mentioned in your statement, David, that you were not a director of Greensill, which of course is true. But Lex Greensill, when he gave his evidence to us this week, stated that you had an open invitation to board meetings and that you attended regularly. Is that the case?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. During the run-up to the pandemic and the pandemic itself, did you take part in discussions on the board of Greensill, or were you there simply as an observer?
Well, I was there invited to attend the board, but I would take part in the board meetings and listen to the arguments and make contributions, sometimes particularly on sort of geopolitical matters and such like. So yes, I was a regular attender and would contribute. But of course, there are a lot of board issues which are director only. I didn't sit on the credit committee. I didn't sit on the risk committee, didn't sit on the audit committee or any of those sorts of functions. So I wasn't involved, as it were, in the day-to-day running of the business or credit decisions. But yes, of course, I'd listen to the discussions and make contributions.
And did those discussions at the time that the pandemic emerged include the difficulties that Greensill may in the future face as a consequence of the pandemic?
I don't recall a particular, because of course the pandemic hit very quickly. I'd have to go back and check exactly when the board meetings were, but I did have discussions with Lex Greensill himself about, what effectively was a sort of, mini economic heart attack as the COVID situation hit. And, we were in a situation where no one knew how high unemployment would go, how badly growth would be affected, exactly what would happen to credit markets. I mean, it was going back to that time, an extraordinary economic period. And so, of course, we were discussing those things.
So would you have discussed the future potential threat that the pandemic posed in terms of the availability, for example, of credit insurance going forward, an increased risk of the clients of the company defaulting, and the pressure on continued access to funding through the securitization process within the model that Greensill was working to?
I don't recall particular discussions on the insurance issue. There were discussions, obviously, about the state of the credit markets and the access to credit markets. And the concern there was that the companies in supply chains that we help to finance, may struggle in those markets. And it was very important to keep those markets open. So yes, there was that discussion, and of course, I'm sure we'll come on to this, the remarks of the Governor of the Bank of England that supply chains were important and the effect of the pandemic on supply chains was something that needed to be looked at.
And did you recognise that the extent that the pandemic would impose pressure on the insurance market, and therefore by extension the ability of Tokai Marine and others to provide insurance to the Greensill business, that was a potential major problem coming down the track that you should have been able to foresee?
I don't recall that particular conversation. As I say, I mean, the main focus of I'll have to go back and check exactly when the board meetings were and whether I was in attendance, but the discussions I remember as COVID hit and as the economic problems started, the discussions were about the state of the credit markets, and the impact that might have on particularly businesses not being able to access credit. And that was really the discussion that we were having. And then that obviously turned into this issue of what could we do to try and help at that stage.
But I'm thinking more about Greensill and its position at the moment. So back at the time when the lobby was happening.
No, well, as I say, I don't recall any particular conversations about the insurance issue. I obviously, in terms of my conversations about Greensill, Greensill was in good financial health. We had the SoftBank investment into the company, which had put $1 billion effectively into the company. Greensill had a successful 2019. It looked set to have a successful 2020. Obviously, COVID was going to have its impact, but at no stage in those conversations was I aware in any way of any concern that Greensill would be in any serious financial difficulty. This might be a tougher year than the one before. No one could quite tell what was around the corner, but there was certainly no sense of jeopardy, if that's what you're asking.
Was there a sense that with the pandemic, the appetite within the insurance sector for taking risk would be diminished? I mean, I think that's a well understood concept, and therefore there might have been some possibility that it would be much more difficult for Greensill to secure that insurance cover, which after all totally underpinned the model that it was running.
As I say, the conversations I remember, I would have to go back to the board meeting. The conversations I remember were more about the state of the credit markets and the ability there would be, as people were talking, I remember this period, the whole conversation in government and finance was what can we do to make sure that banks keep lending? What can we make sure to do to credit markets to stay open, for businesses to access credit? I don't remember particular conversations about the insurance situation, but as I say, I'm not on the credit and risk committees, and so there may have been conversations going on elsewhere, but that wasn't particularly the conversation I was having at that time.
Can I ask you a delicate question, but I think a very important one, because you have spoken in your opening statement about the motivations that you had for the lobbying, etc., helping SMEs and so on. What was the arrangement in broad terms, in terms of your personal arrangement with the business? I believe you may have had some share options, etc. There's been all sorts of speculation in the press, some people saying that you suggested to friends you could, if everything went the right way, make a gain of about £60 million. Others have said that's a vastly inflated figure. Can you tell us something about what you would expect to have gained had your involvement gone to plan and you'd had an effective exit from the business at some point in the future?
Well, I was paid an annual amount, a generous annual amount, far more than what I earned as Prime Minister. And I had shares, not share options, but shares in the business, which vested over the period of time of my contract. And so it's important for the committee to know that I, was absolutely had a big economic investment in the future of Greensill. I wanted the business to succeed. I wanted it to grow. I haven't put a number on those things because while I think it's very important in the questions you're asking, what was my role? How did I carry it out? Was it appropriate to lobby? Did I overstep the mark? The broader questions of what ex-prime ministers should and shouldn't do. The fact that I had this economic interest and a serious economic interest, that's important, but I don't think the amount is particularly germane to answering those questions. And as far as I'm concerned, it's a private matter.
Well, it is and it isn't, though, is it? Because if the incentive was a matter of some tens of thousands of pounds, that would be distinctly different than if it was multiple millions of pounds, I think, in terms of the potential motivation you therefore had for the lobbying that was carried out. I mean, you must accept that. I mean, do you view the £60 million figure as just totally absurd, or are we talking?
That's a completely absurd. It's a completely absurd figure. But I can tell you, the motivation for contacting the government was that I thought we had a really good idea for how to help extending credit to thousands of businesses, and I'd quite like to explain why I thought it was
stop you there. Yeah,
such a great idea, because I think and I've sat on the other side of the fence in government where you have a credit crunch, you have difficulties in the credit market, and you're desperate to get banks lending, and you're desperate to get credit to businesses. And I well remember standing at the dispatch box and being asked, well, this scheme that you announced 6 months ago, how many companies are taking part, how many banks are taking part, and often having to give very disappointing answers. So I was very keen for us to put forward our scheme because I thought it was absolutely in the public interest to try and get money into small businesses.
Okay, that's fine. But my questions, and they are, as I say, delicate questions, but I think they're important questions, because if there is a large amount of money riding on this business succeeding, then that is a different situation to a small amount of money riding on the business succeeding. And I think I take it from what you're saying that there was at least a significant amount.
I wanted this business to succeed. I was being paid, I had shares, I had an interest in it. And I think that's important for the committee to know. And of course, just as if a bank takes part in a loan guarantee scheme, that's good for the country because those loan guarantees will go to businesses. So Greensill, if our scheme had been accepted of being able to use supply chain finance bonds to get cash into businesses up and down the country, that would have been good for those businesses, but also good for us. And I wouldn't hide that for a second. But as I say, the motivation, having been on the other side of the fence, knowing when you're looking for these solutions, that it's so difficult sometimes to make them work, the motivation was about trying to help the government to get those schemes right.
Made that point, and we're clear on that. Thank you. So in your written evidence to us, you said, quote, you became concerned that the company might be in serious financial difficulty in December 2020. Now, that's not quite the same as, for example, at the time of the lobbying, believing that there were looming issues coming down the track. And there seems to be quite a lot of evidence out there that you might have come to that conclusion, that whilst you're right, the company wasn't about to fall over at the start of the pandemic when the lobbying happened, nonetheless, it was going into some fairly choppy waters. Now, Greensill, in his evidence to us, said that at the time of the lobbying, quote, "we did not know what was going to happen next." He said that the CCFF access was a liquidity insurance policy. He went on to say that this was a prudent thing for us to do, in other words, to try and get access to CCFF. He also told us, quote, "It's important also, if I can remind the committee, that for the credit insurance market, COVID was an extraordinarily frightening time when there was an expectation of very, very significant losses." Now, given the centrality of the availability of insurance to the model, and indeed when it was removed, the whole business collapsed. That's quite a powerful thing to say. And he was saying that in relation to the period that the lobbying was occurring. We had press reports throughout the run-up to the pandemic and during in it. For example, on the 4th of May 2020, which was during the period of the lobbying, the FT reported that, and I quote, "Greensill had suffered a raft of client defaults." We had parliamentary questions from Lord Miners asking the government to investigate various aspects of Greensill's business. That goes back to June 2019, well before the lobbying occurred. We had an email from Lex Greensill to Charles Roxburgh at the Bank of England on the 21st of March during the period of the lobbying, in which he says, quote, "With capital markets closed to us, we may need to reduce the credit we can deliver in the coming week, should the CCFF not be open to us." In your email to Sir John Cunliffe of the Bank of England on the 22nd of April, so once again during the, as part of the lobbying, you told him, quote, "While some parts of the capital markets are operating well for Greensill, capacity remains severely constrained." And the FCA, in its response to my letter to them, said, I quote, "In early 2020, and particularly after the onset of the pandemic in March, there was widespread distress in financial markets across financial services firms and other sectors of the economy. It was reported at various times in the media that Greensill may be one of many such firms facing defaults. FCA staff were aware of these reports." Yet you're saying, or seem to be saying, that at the time of the lobbying, you did not believe that there was a significant looming threat to the business. And of course, for Greensill, as a business heading into difficult waters, access to CCFF would have helped Greensill's clients and so helped Greensill itself. So I have to put a difficult question to you, David, and I think it's right that I do so, that many people would conclude that at the time of your lobbying, your opportunity to make a large amount of money was under threat, not least because of the pandemic and its likely future impact on the insurance arrangements that held the whole business together, and that you surely must have known that, and that your fear of losing out on those substantial gains motivated you to conduct this barrage of texts, WhatsApps, emails, meetings, over 60 contacts in total towards government ministers and civil servants. What do you have to say to those who hold that view?
That is not what I felt at the time, and it's not what motivated me. I think there's a huge difference between constrained capacity in the credit markets and the risk of a business failing. And I think when Lex Greensill was in front of you, he also said that he didn't believe there was a danger of the business failing at that time. He didn't think the business faced failure until, as I did, in December 2020. And if you look at what went on and happened in the rest of that year, the business actually had quite a successful year, extending a similar amount of credit in 2020 to what it did in 2019. On the issue of defaults, like any financial institution, you have clients that do occasionally default, but the insurance effectively covered that, as far as I understand. And he gave the example of NMC that did fail for all sorts of reasons, but Greensill was able to recover the money for its clients because of the insurance situation. But I can absolutely say to you that, you know, I really believed in the solution that we had and we were putting to government that I thought would make a difference. And that was my motivation for doing so. I mean, I spent most of my adult life in public service. I believe in it deeply. I would never put forward something that I didn't think was absolutely in the interests of the public good. And that's what I thought I was doing on Greensill's behalf. We'll come on to, I'm sure we can deal with it in detail, the fact that there was, you know, quite a lot of contact and there was quite a lot of persistence, and I can explain why there were very good reasons for that. And I think it's important we cover that. But just to be absolutely clear, I did not believe in March or April, when I was doing this contact, that there was a risk of Greensill falling over. I didn't think that. And I think if you look at what happened later on in that year, when Greensill was looking at a very successful capital raise, a lot of people wanted to invest in the business. I mean, just take the example of furlough. If this was a business in trouble, presumably it would have been furloughing its staff. I think it has 1,000 employees, and it didn't even access furlough until December 2020, when I think it furloughed 6 people in the property department. So, of course, it's absolutely right to ask these questions, but I am 100% clear that my motivation for contacting the government is I thought we had good ideas to help with the credit crisis. And I can see, as I said in my statement, the government actually, I think, did an amazingly good job at introducing schemes that really did work. But at that time, in March and April, there was this sense of schemes being introduced and not working quite properly, and then being amended, and then being reintroduced. Because, I mean, I know what it's like. You're looking for things that are going to work.
Yeah, okay, all right. Let's not get in the furlough schemes and what we get government to. Can I just move on to the Treasury very briefly, and then I'm going to pass on to another committee member. Part of our remit in this inquiry is to satisfy ourselves the Treasury responded to your lobbying appropriately. You would, I think, accept that you would have received additional sort of consideration, shall I put it this way, from the Treasury and the Bank of England by virtue of who you are. Can you kind of quantify, qualify that extra influence that you think you would have had, given that you're a former Prime Minister?
Well, I mean, first of all, I would point you to the evidence that Tom Scholar and Charles Roxburgh gave to the PAC, not yet to your committee, where they effectively said they thought it was perfectly appropriate that they were contacted. They didn't feel under any special pressure. They thought this was an area of business, supply chain finance, that should be looked at. They thought there could be merit if the right scheme could be come up with. I think those are all important considerations. But I would make this point, and this is sort of one of the reasons I thought it was appropriate in these extraordinary times when we were suffering this economic heart attack in the country, to pick up the phone, which is, I knew from my time in government that quite rightly, when there are economic difficulties, the Treasury is in contact with every clearing bank. The clearing bank chairman and chief executives are calling up, quite rightly, talking to the Treasury. And I thought it was important that supply chain finance and fintechs, who are these days extending a lot of credit to small businesses, also were able to put their points. And I think it is an industry that's less well understood, that has less contact. And so I think it was important, as well as talking to the banks, completely right, that this conversation took place as well. And that's why, one of the reasons I think the Treasury officials have concluded that there wasn't sort of improper pressure.
Do you feel that your involvement, A, led the Treasury to open its door to having conversations more readily than it would otherwise have done, and B, that having opened the door, that it got involved in those conversations and the different iterations of your ideas around CCFF, for example, to a greater degree than had you not been involved?
Well, I'm sure, of course, your position makes a difference. But I think that if you're the Chancellor of the Exchequer, you are also taking calls from the heads. And I remember this from our time in government, that you're taking calls from the heads of banks and building societies, and they are getting and quite rightly, I mean, at a time of crisis, and this was the reason for picking up the telephone rather than, as I've said, I think would be better in future, sending one sort of formal letter or email, is that it was a time of crisis. Things were moving very quickly. The government was introducing schemes and plans. And I think there's so the persistence I would explain by, first of all, supply chain finance isn't so well understood. It did need a push to be properly considered. And then, as you say, it went through a series of iterations of a proposal by Greensill, a response by the government, then the government making clear its own scheme. And I think, to be fair, and I'll be very frank about this, I think Greensill made a mistake, and I'm partly responsible for this, is I don't think we got to the best possible answer for how to amend the CCFF or include supply chain finance in the CCFF nearly quickly enough. And had we done that, there would have been less calls, less contacts, perhaps a quarter as much. And I think we got that wrong. But I mean, I would lean quite heavily on what the Treasury officials have said, which is this was effectively a worthwhile conversation, an important thing to talk about. It didn't bend the Treasury or the Bank of England out of shape, and I think was a useful process.
Okay, thank you, David. Thank you for those answers. I'm going to go now to Harriet, please.
Thank you, Chair. And I wanted to just reiterate what the Chair said, that our terms of reference are really looking at the lessons that the Treasury and its associated public bodies can derive from this whole failure of Greensill. And so in that context, I wanted to ask questions about the civil service. And my first question really, and you've mentioned him already, is Tom Scholar. You obviously know him very well. Can you tell us a little bit about your relationship with Tom Scholar?
Well, Tom Scholar and I worked together when I was Prime Minister. He was the sort of number 10 Sherpa for the G20 and G7 meetings, and also helping with the preparations for European Council meetings. I mean, he's an extraordinarily able civil servant. I think we're very lucky to have him. He's now Permanent Secretary to the Treasury. And I think has done a very good job during this pandemic.
And you signed off one of your texts to him, love DC, which was the only one that you signed off, sort of love DC. Can you just help the committee understand, in particular, why you used that to him, or you have a closer or a wider personal relationship outside the formal one that you've just described?
I think I've seen him perhaps once or twice since leaving office. I mean, anyone I know even at all well, I tend to sign off text messages with love DC. I don't know why, I just do. But my children tell me that you don't need to sign off text messages at all, and it's very old-fashioned and odd to do so. But anyway, that's what I do. So
given that the Treasury's guidance to civil servants says that they need to be particularly careful about conflicts of interest with people with whom they have a personal relationship, you would not describe your relationship with Tom Scholar as a personal relationship?
No, as I say, I've seen him once or twice since leaving office in a social context for a drink or such like, to talk about things we did together. But I would make this point, which is goes to these transparency rules, which I think are incredibly important, which is obviously, if anyone contacts an official from business or elsewhere, they're meant to report that, and they all obviously did that in totally the proper way. But crucially, what I was doing on behalf of Greensill was saying, will you look at this proposal and will you talk to this company, in the full knowledge that any meeting that was subsequently held would be transparently reported. So the idea that there was anything sort of behind the hand or surreptitious trying to be attempted is nonsense. These meetings are transparently reported. They weren't before 2010. You could use a freedom of information request to try and find out which businesses ministers have been meeting with. But because of the reforms I introduced in 2010, there's quarterly reporting. You see exactly who's been meeting who, and I think that's very important. And I obviously knew that at the time, and knew that if these meetings took place, which I hope they would, they'd be publicly reported on.
But so you don't have a relationship with Tom Scholar where he comes to your house for lunch, or Sunday lunch, or that's something that wouldn't be captured by the rules that you've described. It's not what you would call a personal relationship. It's strictly based on the it's now nearly 5 years since you were Prime Minister, but the contacts that you had at the time.
Correct.
Yeah. So you've not had lunch with him since you've been Prime Minister then?
I think I had a drink with him. Gave up office, 5 years ago. I think I've seen him, as I say, a couple of times.
But socially, so that it would be captured by these rules, or formally minuted in these rules? Well,
I don't know. I don't know exactly how it's captured, but I suspect if we talked about any business things, then it would be captured by these rules.
Okay. And then can you give us a flavour, because obviously everyone's remarked on the fact that this was pretty intense pressure that you were putting on the system at the time. Is that sort of characteristic of your normal way of doing business? Is this something that if we were to look at your text messages at any period of time, you would be doing a lot of very intensive contact of the different parts of government, or was this specific to the crisis and the pandemic and Greensill?
Very much specific to the crisis. It is worth sort of going back and remembering that moment when, as I say, there was this sort of economic heart stop and no one knew what was going to happen next. And the government was desperately trying to come up with the right schemes and solutions to help make sure that credit was there for businesses and small businesses were supported, and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
And as I said, the reason behind the persistence issue is that, first of all, fintech is different. It's not so well understood. I think that's important. Secondly, I was very enthusiastic about the scheme. And I want to just take a moment.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I only get so much time and I've got quite a few other questions I want to cover. Really sorry. One of the texts that you exchanged, or WhatsApp messages you exchanged with Tom Scholar, you said something like you didn't understand why the Bank of England would be cutting rates during a pandemic. There's a bit cut out of the exchange. But reading it in the way that we can see it, it sort of reads as though you were being told by Tom Scholar that there might be a Bank of England meeting ahead of the actual rate cut taking place.
I've been rather baffled by this text message, because I obviously, rate cuts are a very appropriate thing to do at a time of difficulty. I think I'm a victim of spell check here. I think it was about a VAT cut, but I can't completely. They
wouldn't have been telling you about a VAT cut, would they?
I think I was responding to something that was in the news.
Okay.
But I think I might have been a victim of my own rapid text and failure to spell check. But I think that was going back to the time, I was less sure anyway, I think it was that rather.
Okay. And just to help me understand the players here, Richard Sharp, can you just describe, is that the Richard Sharp who at the time was on the Bank of England Financial Policy Committee? Or is that a different Richard Sharp?
I think the Richard, well, it might be the same one, but he was, I think, drafted into the Treasury as an advisor to Rishi Sunak at the time of the crisis, because he'd been very involved as, I think, a banker in the 2008 crisis, and I think he had that. So we're talking about the former Goldman Sachs banker who was a Bank of England member of the Financial Policy Committee until March 31st, 2019. That Richard Sharp. Right.
Yeah, so I just wanted to make sure it was the same Richard Sharp we were talking about. And then Lawrence Mann, that's the same Lawrence Mann who worked for you when you were in 10 Downing Street, is now your Chief of Staff. Is that a role that's paid for by the taxpayer?
I'm afraid it's far worse for Lawrence Mann, who's been working with me since 2005. So he is my Chief of Staff. He worked for me in Downing Street, worked for me in opposition. My office is partly supported by the former Prime Minister's grant, and that goes towards roles such as responding to public inquiries and government business and answering correspondence and other things that go on even though you're not Prime Minister. And I think that pays a proportion of his salary.
But he's not a civil servant and wouldn't be covered by the Civil Service Code.
No, he's an employee of my office.
Right. So in your analysis and looking at the situation and the lessons that our committee ought to draw in terms of the work of officials at the Treasury from their interaction during this period, do you now regret the fact that they said no? Something that you pushed back on so heavily at the time.
No, I think in the end, they gave very good reasons for why the scheme that they'd introduced couldn't be amended in the way that we were suggesting. And crucially, as I said earlier, we took too long to get to the right answer of how to make the scheme work with supply chain finance. And I think by the time we got to that answer, conditions in the credit markets had eased. And I think actually it's in the evidence from the Treasury wrote a letter saying, not only do we think we can't quite make your scheme work, but actually the credit markets have changed and eased. And so therefore the situation for our customers had eased. But I just want to, I want to explain, because it's an important part of my motivation. The reason I thought our idea was such a good one was, of course, the CCFF, what it did was it bought commercial paper debt for large UK corporates, and that eased their credit conditions and gave them cash to invest in, it could be in paying a supplier, it could be in building a plant or whatever. The strength of what we were suggesting was if you backed supply chain finance bonds as part of the CCFF, every penny of that would go straight into paying the bills early of suppliers to big corporates. So we thought I think it's an important point, because, I wasn't enthusiastic about this just because, we wanted to join in the CCFF. I thought we'd actually found something that was incredibly tailored to a bit of the market that all of us as public servants would want to serve, which is the ability.
But you were very upset when the answer came back no, and you said, I'm going to call absolutely everyone about this. So given what you know now, are you pleased or are you unhappy still about that decision to say no?
I mean, the reason for being baffled was really twofold. One was that this class of assets was included in 2008. And so I thought, well, if it worked in 2008, it seems rather odd we're not doing it now. I was surprised by that. And also, I thought that by the time we got to the final answer of something that was really tailored to British firms, British supply chains, putting that money into small businesses, I think that we had a great idea. But, looking back, I think ultimately, I think the Treasury gave a very good explanation for why, although this scheme, as they put it, could have great merit and could help a lot, it was too different to what the scheme that they'd set up had originally intended to do. And as I said, by the time we got to the end of this iterative process, and Greensill made a mistake by taking too long to get through that iterative process, by the time we got to the end of it, the credit markets had eased up in any event.
And finally, in your message to Richard Sharp, when you said good guy but can be on the cautious side, who were you referring to?
I think I was referring to Charles Roxburgh, but I was making a general point in that, which is, I'm a huge fan of our impartial professional civil service. And I think, throughout this pandemic, they've done an extraordinary job. The point I often make to people is, and it's an important part of being a minister, is there can be an inbuilt bias against doing something. Because of course, if you're a civil servant, there is a worry about taking a step, doing something different, doing something. And so, ministers, I think it's important for ministers to ask themselves, are we being creative and inventive enough? And so that's what I was referring to.
Did Charles Roxburgh and Tom Scholar come to the right decision in this case?
I think they came to a very justifiable decision. It was a useful iterative process. And as I said, I think we took too long to get to the right answer. And that is partly what explains the fact that there were, a number of text messages and emails. I mean, a lot of them were sending the same brief to a number of different people, making these arguments.
Unfortunately, I've taken too long too.
Okay, thank you very much, Harriet. And can I go to Siobhan, please?
Thank you. It's the next big scandal waiting to happen. It's an issue that frankly crosses party lines and has tainted our politics for too long. It's an issue that exposes the far too cosy relationship between politics, government, business and money. I'm talking about lobbying, and we all know how it works. The lunches, the flights, the hospitality, the quiet word in your ear, the ex-ministers and ex-advisors for hire, helping big business find the right way to get its way. Mr. Cameron, do you remember those words?
I do. I made them in 2010, and we made two very important changes.
And yes, you've already mentioned those.
No,
but do you understand? Yes, you have. Do you understand the irony of having used them, given many of us believe that the quote depicts your own behaviour with Greensill?
Well, let me explain, because I haven't mentioned one of the changes that we made, because it was important, which is when I made those remarks, there'd just been, I think, a lobbying scandal involving a firm that was approached by a journalist pretending to be from the government of Uzbekistan. And the lobbying firm in question said, we can get you into ministers, we can get you to see people, and no one needs to know who you are lobbying on behalf of. And so the change that the Lobbying Act brought in, I know it's criticized now, but the change the Lobbying Act brought in, which was to make sure that multi-client lobbyists had to register who their clients were, that was an important change because it put a stop to that problem. And if you combine it with the issue of having to report the meetings that ministers have, you got two very valuable tools in making sure that people can see who is lobbying whom and on whose behalf. And as I said, in my interactions from Greensill to the government, I absolutely knew that if the meetings I wanted to take place did take place, they would be properly reported on and everyone would know about them. And that is absolutely right. And of course, before
Cameron, I'm ever so sorry, but this is a meeting to ask you questions rather than to allow you to talk for the next 2 hours. You had the enormous privilege of being the Prime Minister of our great country. You're one of only 5 people post-war to have been re-elected to lead our government. Do you not feel that you have demeaned yourself and your position by WhatsApping your way around Whitehall on the back of a fraudulent enterprise based on selling bonds of high-risk debt to unsuspecting investors?
Well, my view is that what I did was I made a choice to work for a business which I hoped would be a UK fintech success story, and many people believe that it would. And I wanted to help that company grow and expand. And what I did at the time of economic crisis was put to the government what I genuinely believed to be a good idea for how to get money into the hands of small businesses and get their bills paid early. I've said that, looking back and now looking forward, ex-prime ministers are in a very important and different position. And so a single letter or email would be more appropriate. But we were in very different circumstances when COVID happened.
But do you not think that you were presenting a business that had fundamental financial problems and the efforts were in order to fill the holes in that business rather than help the British taxpayer?
My interaction with the government is because I genuinely believed these were good ideas to help small businesses. And if you look at of course, this business went into administration, it failed, and we need to learn the lessons from that. And there are lots of lessons, and I look forward to reading what your committee has to say about it. But what I don't accept is that it was a business that was predetermined to fail. At its heart was a simple and good idea, which is to go to large corporate companies like Airbus with 26,000 suppliers.
You don't believe it was a Ponzi scheme, because that's what Lord Miners told us.
Well, no, if you take the Airbus example, which was a leading client of Greensill, we were paying the 25,000 suppliers instantly, getting cash into tens of thousands of small businesses, and then Airbus would pay back Greensill and a bond would be floated in the meantime. That idea of using technology and deep capital markets to help small businesses, that is a good idea.
As recently as Tuesday, Mr. Greensill, who you seem to be painting as a reincarnation of the late Mother Teresa, told the committee that this was a great business only brought down by unreasonable and greedy insurance companies. We now know that 90% of Greensill's business was lending against transactions that have never happened, may never happen, and with companies that don't even know that they are involved, and then selling it on at low risk. Mr. Cameron, do you still believe that that business model was a good one?
What I believe is that the key idea of supply chain finance, of going to big companies and saying, we will pay your suppliers early, get cash into those businesses, that is a good idea. And the companies that Greensill work with, like Vodafone and AstraZeneca and Ford Motor Company and Airbus, big responsible employers, big important companies.
Cameron, do you know what a prospective receivable is?
Well, I've listened very carefully to the evidence you've been hearing over previous days, and the concept of prospective.
That didn't involve any of the companies you just listed.
Well, let's deal with future receivables, which I think is the correct term. And future receivables were involved in the supply chain finance scheme that I helped to set up in government, which was the way that the NHS, under this scheme, pharmacies were paid early. And pharmacies, of course, are very small.
When during the height of the crisis, you were bothering ministers and civil servants, did you know that 90% of Greensill's business represented unsecured loans to high-risk borrowers, and half the time without any invoice whatsoever?
Well, that's not a figure I recognise. I listened to Mr. Greensill's evidence to you on Tuesday, where he talked about future receivables being perhaps 20% of the business. And I think when it comes to future receivables, it is important to recognise that in the case of the NHS and the pharmacy scheme,
Can I just ask you a question about the NHS? Turning now to Greensill's proposals for our NHS, and that named earned to pay doctors and nurses daily or weekly in advance. Do you accept that your lobbying of the NHS wasn't for its health, but for the health of Greensill's balance sheet?
I wouldn't accept that for 1 second, because the whole concept of earned in the NHS was that it was going to be free to not just the employee, but also free to the NHS itself. Why I thought this was so attractive is that, I remember probably answering questions from you about the evils of payday lending, and the idea that staff in the NHS can draw down their salary as they earn it, rather than have to wait till the end of the month. I think that could go some way to ending the use of payday lending. And of course, this is really important point.
Mr. Cameron, Greensill's own administration documents make clear, and I quote, "The commercial rationale for providing these services without profit was to create critical mass, to enable Earned UK to sell to corporate entities to generate revenues and to provide cross-selling opportunities to the wider group." So I ask you again, do you now accept that your lobbying of the NHS was about a commercial incentive for Greensill?
No, I don't accept that, because
it's nothing sacred.
No, from Greensill's point of view, this was part of its corporate social responsibility program of saying to the NHS, this is going to be free, not just to the doctors and nurses, but free to the NHS trusts as well. And
of course, it left Greensill free to sell to corporate entities to generate revenues and to provide cross-selling opportunities to the wider group. Not my words, Greensill's words.
But you asked me about...
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thanks very much, Siobhan. I'm going to go to Julie now, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. Good afternoon, Mr. Cameron.
Hi.
I'd like to go back and explore in a bit more detail something you referred to in your opening statement, and I think is something of a thread throughout this session, which is your particular position as a former Prime Minister. Former Prime Ministers are quite a rare and exceptional breed. When we heard from Lord Macpherson a couple of weeks ago from this committee, he said that generally former Prime Ministers don't generally contact the Treasury. It's quite exceptional. They might say, check up some records or issues relating to your time in office, but actually to talk about policy, to lobby is quite exceptional. Would you accept that it really is quite an exceptional course of action that you took over this period?
Well, these were exceptional times when business was uniquely threatened. No one knew what was going to happen to the economy, and I knew from my own experience of being in government that the government was considering what sort of loan support schemes, what sort of loan guarantee schemes, what would work. And so these were extraordinary times. And as I've said, I think it would be better for an ex-Prime Minister in future, and I will certainly abide by this, if you're contacting the government about any commercial issue, and this would be a very rare event, to send one formal letter or one formal email. But I think these were exceptional times.
Lord Macpherson also said, for example, if a former Prime Minister did contact government department, it would usually be potentially on a broader point of policy. But isn't the point here that the point of policy that you were talking about was something in which you had a very specific economic interest, has been referenced previously?
Well, it was something that I was passionate about because I thought that it could really help small businesses and supply chains in the United Kingdom. So that was why I was so keen to contact the government. As I've said, I know what it's like when you're searching for things that will help business when credit markets dry up, when there's difficulties in the economy. And I thought we had a very good answer. And I was very keen, as I said, for it to be listened to, because the banks are quite rightly on speed dial with the Treasury. Everyone knows, when troubles hit. And I think Paul Miners, in his evidence to you, said that he would often be talking, to 10 bank chairman and chief executive every week in that sort of situation. And I think it is important to recognize the change in patterns of lending, where you've now got fintech firms and non-bank financial institutions extending huge amounts of credit to small businesses. It's very important to have that conversation as well.
Do you accept that you are different to a bank chief executive? And do you think that that is a different circumstance? And did you ever consider the impact that that would have on the people receiving the calls and the letters and the emails and so on?
Of course, I thought very carefully before picking up the telephone, and I thought the circumstances warranted it because they were unique. But I've reflected since then and thought, in future, as I said, it'd be much better one single communication. But I think these were exceptional times, and that's why I think it was acceptable to do what I did. And I think it's very important to listen to Nick McPherson. I have great respect for him, but I'm sure you'll also hear from Tom Scholar and from Charles Roxburgh, who've said in their evidence that there was no improper, they didn't feel improper pressure. They thought it was right to consider this sort of scheme. It could be made to work. And the Bank of England have pretty much said the same thing. So I don't think they were bent out of shape in terms of their resources and the sort of time they spent on this. And I have said that I think we took too long to get the right answer, and that was frustrating for me as well as for them. But they've said that talking to business is part of what they do.
And you said quite rightly, we all remember it. You've been at the dispatch box, you have been on the receiving end of lobbying and ideas and so on. To what extent do you think it's fair that someone, as a former Prime Minister with the range of experience, the knowledge of the system, the contacts and so on, that you should have that same level of access and that same ability to influence and lobby?
Well, I think it's a very good question. As I said in my opening statement, maybe there is a case for a longer period of time before there's any commercial contact between an ex-Prime Minister and a department. I've also thought carefully. I noticed that Gordon Brown, I think, said there should be no contact whatsoever on a commercial issue. I would stop one short from that, because I could potentially imagine Gordon Brown or John Major being chairman of a big bank or British Telecom or some strategically important British company. And I think the idea of there being no contact then between a former politician and the government wouldn't make sense. I mean, for instance, as Prime Minister, I used to meet very regularly with Bob Dudley, who was the chair of BP. I think that's right. You've got strategically important companies that do need to talk to government. And while it's very important we regulate lobbying properly, while it's very important we report meetings transparently, while it's important we look at all those rules, we mustn't get to a situation where the public sector is cut off from the private sector. So yes, ex-prime ministers are different. Yes, we need to think and act differently. Yes, there are lessons to learn. I completely accept that. But I wouldn't go quite as far as Gordon Brown, although I agree with him about many things.
So is it fair? Would you accept a criticism to say that you are putting forward some potential solutions and lessons to be learning from this, that if you had perhaps been more aware or self-aware and cognizant of potentially the impact of the lobbying from a former Prime Minister, from yourself, that we wouldn't have to be looking at changing the rules at this point, or more rules?
Well, I would say two things to that. The first is that clearly these civil servants were not intimidated by getting a call from me or from looking at this proposal, or from dealing with Greensill and the fintech sector. If you look at what they said to the Public Accounts Committee, they thought it was appropriate, and they got on and looked at the scheme. I think that's the first thing. As I say, I think ex-prime ministers are different, and I think we should be looking at the rules, just because there's no harm in trying to work out, is there more you could do? I mean, I think ACABA as a process, which I've been through with a number of different appointments, it does work well. But I can see an argument that says, for an ex-prime minister, where you've got to make choices when you leave office, and I made a series of choices and about the charities I'd work with and the businesses I'd support, perhaps there is a role for a sort of a committee of some former permanent secretaries and people with great business experience to give advice on that, because there isn't really a roadmap for a ex-prime minister, perhaps particularly for a younger one who doesn't just want to, be on the board of some big bank and make the odd speech around the world, but who wants to get stuck in and help a business grow and expand. perhaps there could be a role for that sort of committee to give that sort of advice, and perhaps I would have found that beneficial.
Thank you. Can I just turn to the relationship between yourself and Lex Greensill during this period? You've mentioned some strategic objectives that you felt you had in joining Greensill. Could you just give us a feel for how much direction on a day-to-day basis, a week-to-week basis, you had from Lex Greensill, both in sort of what we might call normal times, and then as it became more of a crisis moment?
Well, I was contracted to work with the business for a number of days every year. I think I comfortably exceeded that because I was enthusiastic about what this company was doing. I'd probably talk to Lex Greensill once a week. And the sort of work we were doing was trying to win new clients, whether in the UK or elsewhere. We were looking at how to expand best into new territories. I think he said in his evidence that while I was working for the business, we increased by 50 or 100 the number of countries we were operating in. I would try and help him with some of the key relationships with suppliers, companies like Oracle and SAP, who were crucial to the way the business worked. So it was really helping with expansion as well as the sort of more traditional advisory role about geopolitical and other advice. So that's the sort of, it was a good relationship. I enjoyed working with the company. I'm extremely sorry and sad that it has come to this end. Clearly, as he said, there were faults with the business. There were vulnerabilities that weren't properly addressed. But I repeat again, I think we mustn't get into this situation in this country where just because a business goes into administration, it doesn't mean that everything about it was wrong. It doesn't mean the whole thing was some necessarily giant fraud. You know, there were, I think, very strong and important parts to supply chain finance that can have a real social benefit. That's why I joined the company in the first place.
But for example, during perhaps more of the crisis period, would Lex Greensill say to you, would you phone up Rishi Sunak? Would you text him? Would you get on to the Treasury? Would you get on to Matt Hancock? Would he direct you and give you particular, missions or objectives in that kind of way?
No, the conversations that we had, I think, started with the chairman of the Bank of England making this remark about the importance of supporting supply chains during the pandemic. And I think in one of our conversations, I said I'd try and find out more about what was meant by that. When it came to this issue of our proposal to improve the CCFF with this supply chain finance idea, which, as I've said, would be, we thought, very targeted because all the money would go to small and medium-sized businesses. It was then a question of, well, what's the best way of trying to get this in front of government? And that is what I helped with. And I helped with that because it was a moment of crisis and I believed it was a good idea.
So I don't want to put words in your mouth, but would we be characterising that in that case that really you self-directed, you made the judgments on who to lobby, when to lobby them and how often to lobby them, for example?
Well, I had the discussions with him and perhaps one or two others, so I could properly understand how the CCFF was meant to work, what our proposal would do to improve it, and how best to try and get government to at least consider it.
Thank you very much, Chair. I think I'm out of time. Thank you, Mr. Cameron.
Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. And Emma, please.
Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon, Mr. Cameron. Just a couple of quick questions at the beginning. Has the Chancellor published every SMS or WhatsApp message that he sent you in relation to Greensill?
I believe he has, yes.
Okay, thank you. Did you and the Chancellor speak over the phone about Greensill's CCFF or C-bills?
Yes.
Did you speak on the 18th of May?
I'd have to check the records, but I think we definitely did speak. I think possibly a couple of times, but I think it's all in the return I sent to the committee.
Okay, could you tell us what was discussed?
What I was discussing with him from memory was, my contention that the CCFF was a brilliant idea because it was helping large British-based corporates to have access to cash and credit at a time of difficulty, and how including supply chain finance bonds in that facility would be even more effective because every penny of that money would go into small businesses. So I was very passionate about it. I thought it was a really good idea. And I think I was drawing, as I said, on my experience as Prime Minister, when schemes that you announced didn't quite work the way you wanted.
Okay. I'm just going through these quite quickly. Just on that conversation on the 18th of May, were the Treasury officials dialed in, or was it a private conversation between you and the Chancellor?
I don't know. You'd have to ask the Chancellor that. I don't think there was anyone listening my end, but there might well have been his end.
Okay, just earlier on, actually, in response to one of my colleagues, you said something about that you didn't believe that the resources of the Treasury were bent out of shape with the time spent or resources. Do you accept that 56 lobbying attempts of ministers and officials during a pandemic, when, as you've already said, the economy was on life support, when the Treasury was working 24/7, and we've heard evidence earlier that time spent responding to your lobbying means time not spent responding to other areas of need, companies in need, and indeed regions in need around the rest of the country? Have you never reflected back and considered that you maybe went over the top?
Well, I would draw very heavily on what Charles Roxburgh said at the Public Accounts Committee when he said, in answer to a question, that was not a disproportionate use of time at all. Had the proposal proved workable, it could have been a way to support a large number of small businesses at a time of crisis. And he also makes the point that the proposal that was come up with ultimately resulted in a consultation with 10 other supply chain finance companies, and that it was a useful exercise. As I say, I definitely accept that one of the reasons for the persistence was that we took too long to get the best possible scheme to the government, and that was our fault, for which we should take responsibility. But the civil servants, from what I've heard, are saying this was an interesting proposal. It's our job to engage with business. It didn't take up disproportionate amount of time, and if it could have worked, it would have been a good exercise.
With respect, Mr. Cameron, I wasn't asking what you believed the opinion of the civil servants to be. I was asking what your opinion is. Do you believe that 56 attempts of lobbying during a pandemic using Treasury ministers and officials' time that could have been spent elsewhere was a useful use of their time? I'm not asking you what the civil service think. I'm asking whether you've reflected on it and what you think.
Well, I have reflected on it, and I think it was a time of extraordinary crisis. And so it was a time when I think it was appropriate to use phone and text and email and letter. But I think in future, one of the lessons I take away is prime ministers should only ever use a letter or email and should restrict themselves far more. But the reason for quoting the civil servants is, in a way, that's the answer to the question. I mean, if they're saying we weren't putting disproportionate time, we weren't bent out of shape, then I think that is a significant and important point.
Did the Chancellor tell you what the quote alternative was that he quote pushed his officials to explore on your behalf?
I think from memory that's the Treasury and the Bank of England made a proposal for how supply chain finance could be included in the CCFF, and they put that to Greensill and others. But Greensill and others didn't think that it would work in the form that was put forward. So this is why, I mean, one of the reasons there were all these contacts was it was an iterative process. The original Greensill proposal, an amended proposal, a proposal from the government, it went through a lot of phases, and that's, I think, set out in the evidence to you from the Bank of England and the Treasury. And I think what that text refers to is the government's proposal back to the supply chain finance providers.
Okay, just to take one day, for example, on the 3rd of April, you received some bad news that the Treasury did not intend to revise the terms of the CCFF. From what we can tell, on the same day, you WhatsApped the Chancellor of the Exchequer, you called the Economic Secretary to the Treasury, you called the Downing Street SPAD, you emailed the Deputy Governor at the Bank of England, you also texted Michael Gove and Tom Scholar. All in all, there were 2 calls and 16 written communications on a single day to 6 different people, all of whom would have had other things to do in the midst of a rapidly developing crisis. The following day, you secured a call with the Chancellor. Do you still think this was appropriate?
Well, I think it was a time when the government was looking at what schemes can actually get cash to businesses and work. And we believe we had one of those schemes. We thought it was worth a proper look. And of course, as I said, it went through an iterative process where they came back with a proposal. So I think but as I say, standing back from it, looking back at it now, I do understand that ex-prime ministers have to be very careful about what they do and very careful about the measures they take. And in normal times, and I will certainly restrict myself to this, if ever there's an occasion, and I doubt there will be, but if ever there's occasion when a business has a commercial proposition to put to government, it will be a single letter or email.
Okay, and the final point, earlier on, you said that you usually put love DC on the bottom of your text, and therefore you were explaining this shows no particular closeness or relationship with Tom Scholar. But from what we can see from all the other texts that you sent, it doesn't appear anywhere else to love DC, even on your text to Michael Gove and to Rishi Sunak. So do you want to sort of reflect on whether or not you want to talk about the relationship you had with Tom Scholar?
I think I've accurately reflected the relationship I have with Tom Scholar. I mean, I'm very happy to check up how many times I've met him socially since I left office in 2016. I think it is 2. So the 2 in 5 years is not a huge amount. I don't know Rishi Sunak that well. We were in Parliament together for a period of time, but I don't know him that well. But I think I can produce a list of friends and relations who have love DC on the end of their text messages.
Yes, but just maybe not love DC to Michael Gove. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Emma. And could I go to Felicity now, please?
Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon. Good to see you. You mentioned in your opening remarks that you thought carefully before taking the role at Greensill and that you took advice from a wide number of people. Can I ask you specifically what due diligence you did do on Greensill before accepting the role, and how familiar you were with their business and their business model?
I did think about it very carefully. I consulted a couple of very senior business leaders who are people I've worked with when in government. I talked to, I think, 2 financial analysts to ask their view about the company. I met with not just Lex Greensill, but with the chairman of the company, Maurice Thompson, someone who has, I think, 30 years of experience in British banking and finance. I met with the venture capitalist, John Gorman, who had originally invested in Lex Greensill and was still working with him. Obviously, I asked lots of questions of the company about every aspect of the business, from the role of insurance to the way the Credit Suisse and other funds work to the list of customers. But I think, to be frank, one of the things I took the greatest comfort from was General Atlantic, who I hugely admire as an investor. They had just invested in the business, and this company had as customers people like Airbus and Vodafone and AstraZeneca, and had partnerships with companies like Credit Suisse and Oracle and others. So it was a mixture of all those things, but I certainly did do quite a lot of due diligence and asked a lot of questions and tried to make sure I understood the core to what the business was doing.
Now, to me, there were several red flags about this business even back then. One was the exposure that it had to Gupta and his family of companies, and indeed the interdependence between Greensill and Gupta and his companies. And then clearly Gam and Tim Haywood had been in the press just a month before, in July 2018. Were you aware of those issues, and did they give you concern at the time?
Yes, of course, I was aware of them. I think taking them separately, on the GAM issue, that was reported widely in the newspapers. I asked a lot of questions about it, got a lot of reassurances about it. It's a complicated issue, but ultimately, one of the funds that was closed, all the investors received their money back, and there was a GAM Greensill supply chain fund that continued to operate, I believe, successfully pretty much throughout the time that I was working for the company. And of course, the Credit Suisse funds at the same time were expanding. And so one of the key questions for the company was, have you got the distribution potential for these assets you're creating from the finances you're providing to small businesses? And the list of banks that was buying these was growing, and there were the other funds. So I think that I asked questions about, I thought was important, but I thought I got satisfactory answers. The issue of client concentration, and specifically on Gupta and GLG, I think this was something I did ask about before joining, and asked a lot of questions about while I was there. The reassurance I always got was that there was a plan to deal with this concentration and over time reduce this concentration. But obviously that is not something that happened satisfactorily. And I think, I think you heard that from Mr. Greensill when he gave his evidence, that it's an important concern.
And did your view of the company change over time? Was there anything that concerned you over time?
Well, at the time, I joined the company in August 2018, just after the General Atlantic investment, where, of course, they'd done an enormous amount of due diligence. And then during the time I was working for the company, there was this big SoftBank investment. Now, I know SoftBank and the Vision Fund isn't everybody's cup of tea, but nonetheless, they are a heavyweight investor and again do a lot of due diligence. And the number of partnerships and customers seem to be growing in a healthy way. I mean, as I tried to say to one of your colleagues, my enthusiasm for this business was very simply based on the idea that if you team up with large corporates, you pay their suppliers early, you're pumping money into small businesses, and anyone who goes anywhere near a small business knows that cash flow and credit and working capital are absolutely crucial to their success and survival. That is why I believe this was a worthwhile business. And so the more we could add those big corporate clients, many of which were added while I was working with the company, I thought the stronger the company would be. But clearly, this company has failed. If you work for a company that goes into administration, you look back and think of all the different choices you could have made. And of course, I'm doing that. But as I say, during the period I was working for it, there were good signs of strengthening. But there was this issue of Gupta, which I don't think was adequately dealt with, and that became a looming problem.
And clearly the business model here was to have the receivables, package them up with credit insurance, and then on-sell them to Credit Suisse Asset Management and then to investors. Were you aware in September that Tokio Marine had decided not to renew the credit insurance? Because again, that would be a flag to me that the business model was in real jeopardy.
Well, I wasn't a director of the company and I wasn't on the credit or risk committees. I don't think I was aware of the deadline with Tokio Marine. I listened every week to the sort of company podcast that was describing how the company was going, and there seemed to be a good position with 28 insurers, I think it was, and a number of new insurers coming on board. So I don't think I was aware about that looming deadline. I mean, one point I make is, when you're an advisor to a company but not a director, one of the things you ask yourself is, does this company have an effective legal function? Does it have an effective credit committee, risk committee, audit committee? Is it a strong board? And the answer to all those questions seemed to me to be pretty positive. And of course, as an advisor, not a director, you take comfort from that.
And just on that point, were you concerned that the chair had come from Citibank, where Mr. Greensill had worked, and perhaps the chair was not sufficiently independent? I'm not making an allegation saying that he wasn't, but I am aware that they worked together in the past.
I from what I saw of how Maurice Thompson worked, I thought he was he had this extraordinarily long experience in banking and finance, not just at Citibank, but at Warburg's, I think, before. He was a very effective chairman. I think he, held the management to account from what I could see effectively. And again, you know, when you're thinking about being an advisor to a company, that's one of the questions you ask is the capabilities of the chairman and the people on the board.
Yes. And can I just ask you about your role with clients? You said that part of your mission was to go out there and win new business. I do believe that you actually went to visit the credit insurers in Australia. What was the nature of that visit and that meeting?
That meeting was really a sort of general catch up and getting to know you meeting. I was in Australia, I think I was giving a lecture tour to a Australian Jewish organization. And because I was in Australia and Lex Greensill was in Australia, he said, I think we did a meeting with some clients and prospective clients. And we also went to see this insurer, but it was not a significant business meeting. It was just a getting to know, checking in with, and for me to get to know them.
And did you meet a Mr. Brereton there, who was subsequently fired, as my understanding, for exceeding his risk limits to Greensill Capital?
I don't remember exactly who I met. I'd have to. I mean, I may have a record of it. I may not.
I understand. And I believe your office has denied this, but there have been reports that Mr. Greensill was offering up meetings with you almost as rewards if people in government accepted meetings with him. Can you just categorically say that you were not aware of that practice?
Totally not aware of that. I would carry out a lot of meetings for the company, whether it was with customers or suppliers or partners or what have you, but I'm not aware of that at all.
Yes, and I'm being told that my time is up. So just one final question. Do you regret your involvement with Greensill? And as you look forward, because you're clearly still a very young man and may take on other opportunities, will you take on more commercial opportunities going forward? Is that something that you still have on your agenda?
Well, I think that when you work for a company that goes into administration, as I said, you look back and you think, what different choices could I have made? All I can say to this committee is, my real focus since leaving office has been things like Alzheimer's and dementia and fragile states and the commission that I chair. And I wanted to have a range of business interests as well. I mean, I chose Greensill because I thought it was an exciting UK-based tech company that would be, rolled up sleeves working in rather than just a brass nameplate on the door. Obviously, what's happened is deeply regrettable and is very, being part of a company that goes into administration is, I mean, it's depressing, but never mind me. It's, for the people who've lost their jobs, they had whole futures invested in, this company being their future. And it's incredibly depressing to see it go wrong. In terms of my own situation, I think I have some commercial interest, but I've got a lot of work on with dementia. I chair the early diagnosis board for how we can try and diagnose dementia earlier and therefore find the cure. And I think that's the most important mission I've got at the moment, and maybe now we'll have even more time to pursue it.
Thank you.
Thanks, Felicity. Angela, please.
Thank you very much. Mr. Cameron, I've read your 56 messages, and they're more like stalking than lobbying. Looking back, aren't you at least a little bit embarrassed about the way you behaved?
As I said, it was a particularly acute time in the British economy. The government was introducing plans to try and help businesses. We thought we had a good idea. I was keen to get it in front of government. But as I've said, there are lessons to learn and lessons for me to learn. And in future, the single formal email or formal letter would be appropriate. But it was a particular, I think it's easy to forget now just what a sort of time of economic shock it was.
Many of us don't forget there were thousands of people dying at the time and the country was in a serious situation. Now, you've said your role at Greensill was as an advisor. Did you ever write to NHSX describing yourself as a director of the company?
I think there was an email which I've seen where I think I described Bill Carruthers as a fellow director, and it was a mistake. And if that's the one you're referring to, that was a mistake. I wasn't a director of the company. I was an advisor, and as I said, I didn't sit on any of those sort of subcommittees of the board that are so important
Okay.
to a company like that.
Did you do the same in writing to counterparties in Australia?
I
Describe
don't
yourself
believe
as a
I did.
director.
I don't believe I did, no.
Will you undertake to check your records and keep the committee informed of the outcome of a check that you do on that?
Of course.
Thank
Happy.
you very much. Mr. Greensill told me that you had a standing invite to board meetings and that you attended regularly. You've said today you attended regularly, and that you had a lot to say at some of those board meetings. Do you know what a shadow director is under section 2511 of the Companies Act 2006? And are you aware of the consequences of you being found to be a shadow director?
Well, I am aware. I'm not a lawyer, but my understanding of this is the shadow director issue is when you have a company that has a board, but the real person controlling that company is actually not on the board. And that is what the concept of the shadow director is. And in my case, there's absolutely no question that I was in any way controlling this company while not being on the board. So I don't think that applies to me at all.
Okay. At the time you started your incredibly frenetic lobbying of the Chancellor, were you aware that BaFin, the German regulator, had given Greensill instructions to reduce their loan concentration to Gupta?
I don't believe that I was, but again, I may have to check the records, but
So
I don't.
that wasn't discussed at the meetings that you attended, the board
I
meetings?
don't believe so, but I can certainly go back and check. I mean, I think it's an important question. What was the closest board meeting before the pandemic struck? And I don't recall off the top of my head, but I don't remember that, but I don't want to give an inaccurate answer.
So again, perhaps you could check and get back to us about that. Were you aware that most of the coronavirus interruption business loans made by Greensill Bank were to Gupta names and friends, which is actually increasing Greensill's concentration and exposure to Gupta rather than reducing it?
Well, as I said, I wasn't on the credit committee, so I wasn't responsible for extending any credit, any loan to any client, including Mr. Gupta. So I didn't know about the exact nature of those loans, no.
And these things weren't discussed at the board's meetings that you attended? I mean, did the credit and committees not give reports at the board of directors? Would you not have heard some of that while you were attending board meetings?
I don't remember that. I remember with the CCFF, there was a lot of discussion outside the board because this was happening in real time. And it was a very good scheme the government had set up that we had this proposal to amend. In terms of the other schemes, there were discussions, as I understand it, between Greensill and the British Business Bank, discussions which I wasn't involved in at all, of the process of being an accredited lender. I'm sure they were reported back to board meetings, but it's not something I had any involvement in.
Okay, now Lex Greensill told me that you were a PAYE employee of the company. How much were you paid for that role? You gave us a hint a bit earlier, saying it was more than you earned as Prime Minister. Is it more than Boris Johnson earned when he was on the backbenches? Can you give us more of a ballpark figure?
I was well paid in terms of the annual amount, and I had these shares. But as I said to your chairman, I think it's important for the committee to know I had that economic interest. I was committed to this company. I wanted to work for it. I would benefit if the company succeeded. But all the questions you're asking and addressing quite rightly in your committee about lobbying and about this behavior and what ex-prime ministers should do and how the Treasury worked, I don't think they're affected by the amount of it, and so I don't consider. I would consider that a private matter.
But perhaps, Mr. Cameron, given that this company collapsed, that it took, we know, at least £400 million of government-backed loans via the British Business Bank with it, that it's cost between £1 and £3 billion of taxpayers' money, that there are German towns suffering because of the stricken nature of the Greensill Bank in Germany. Don't you think that what you were earning and how it motivated your personal lobbying of government is a matter of public interest?
Well, what I would say is that my motivation in talking to the government was about how to introduce a scheme that I thought would benefit small businesses.
But
And
likewise, if this gap bank had actually floated successfully, you would have been a multimillionaire, wouldn't you?
But I'd also make the point that, I mean, Lex Greensill himself probably talked to the government in terms of meetings he had more than I did. And when he was in front of you on Tuesday, you didn't think it was relevant to ask what he earned or what his shares were. I mean, I think the point is the same, which is, yes, I had an economic interest in this company. I was committed to the company. I was paid by it. I had shares in it. I wanted it to succeed. But I think the actual quantum of it, I don't think is actually relevant to answering the questions that you have to answer.
And have you paid UK tax on your earnings, or are you keeping them offshore?
They're all tax has been paid on them, and it's all onshore. Good
to know. It was reported in the Wall Street Journal today that you made several $1 million from cashing out stock options in 2019. Is that true? And again, have you kept all of those earnings onshore and paid tax on them?
Everything I've done, I've paid full UK tax on, whether that is capital gains tax or income tax. I don't have any money offshore. I have an office of David Cameron, which I fund through some of the work that I do, and I earn some money in a personal capacity, but every proper tax is paid, income and capital gains.
Can I just ask you about prospective receivables? You seem like Mr. Greensill was reluctant to recognise that phrase and talk about future receivables instead. Yet that phrase does feature in court documents in America. And it also features in correspondence that Mr. Gupta had with the Financial Times over fraudulent invoices, it seems, that were securitized by Greensill. How much do you know about prospective receivables, and how much was Greensill Bank involved in securitizing phantom invoices?
Well, I think, you got answers from Lex Greensill on Tuesday, who was running the business and who was involved in these credit and other decisions. He explained that he thought the term was future receivables rather than prospective receivables. The point I would make is, and I think he said that only 20% of the business was future receivables rather than actual receivables. But I think the example he gave, and I'm happy to give a couple of others, is that there's nothing abnormal about providing finance on the basis of future receivables. I mean, when the NHS...
I agree with that, so long as they're predictable. But actually, Gupta was talking about prospective receivables, not future receivables. And we do know that Greensill had a pretty twisted symbiotic relationship with Gupta.
Well, I think that I heard Mr. Greensill's evidence where he said that, all financing had to be based on actual invoices and not, of course, any fake invoices. And that's a very important consideration. But I think, and your committee will have to think about how to answer this, but what I wouldn't do is to say that all financing on the basis of future receivables is a bad idea. I mean, no,
I wouldn't say that as either, but
phantom
invoices are a bad idea.
Phantom invoices, of course, we knew that would be a very serious accusation.
Okay, and finally, how many times did you use one of the Greensill's fleet of private planes to fly to or from Newquay, close to your third home, or any other non-business declarations? And what is your estimate of the value of your use of the Greensill fleet? And have you declared these as taxable benefits?
I haven't got a complete record of the use of planes. I mean, it was used quite a lot by Lex Greensill and senior managers, and sometimes myself, on business visits. And I did use it a handful of times on other visits. And of course, all proper taxes and all those things would be dealt with in the proper way.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Angela. And going now to Anthony, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, David Cameron, for coming to give evidence to our committee. I just want to follow up a couple of questions that Angela Eagle was asking about the prospective receivables. And I completely support, what you say about the role of supply chain finance. I myself have helped promote it, and securitizing supply chain finance assets is not necessarily an issue. And doing future receivables, such as with the pharmacies, not an issue at all. The issue here is where there have been a lot of stories in the media about Grant Thornton, the administrator, coming across, trying to unravel all this and coming across invoices where the companies that are supposedly issued the invoices said they had absolutely no commercial arrangement with Liberty Commodities, with Gupta, and they certainly seem to be fraudulent, or they were. And we don't know whether they were made up by the Gupta, or whether Greensill knew about this or not. When you must have read these reports, and you must have been concerned about what was going on under the bonnet there, even if you didn't know it at the time.
No, well, the recent reports that have come out about this are clearly very disturbing, if true. As I say, I wasn't involved in credit extension, not to Gupta, but to any company. That wasn't part of my role. But obviously there's a difference between future receivables, known cash flows. For instance, your mobile phone in your pocket, you pay for with a contract, and that is a sort of future receivable, if you like. There's a difference between that and something that, non-existent prospective clients that, haven't even been contacted yet. That is a different thing. So look, I don't know any more than you do about that. I've read that in the newspapers. It seems concerning, and I'm sure that it needs to be got to the bottom of.
And some of the previous witnesses we've had said that, securitizing these invoices where the companies actually don't have any commercial arrangement with Liberty, with Gupta, and securitizing them and then selling them on as assets. They're quite clear that this is very strong appearance of basically being fraudulent. How concerned are you about that? That actually, fundamentally here, there was a large amount of fraud going on.
Well, I certainly, haven't seen any evidence of that myself directly. I thought Mr. Greensill sort of explained the difference between actual receivables,
he avoided answering the questions on it.
Security that goes with future receivables, the role of insurance. But obviously, that is, if what is being suggested is true, then that properly needs to be looked at.
Some of the evidence we've been taking earlier was really about the role of financial regulation here, and supply chain finance, as you know, isn't regulated, and the Greensill itself is.
I think the important point there, which is, business lending isn't regulated. I think it'd be wrong to sort of single out supply chain finance.
Yeah, absolutely.
Supply chain finance is trying to hide in some sort of dark corner. It is a form of business lending, and business lending isn't regulated. You're the expert here, having run the British Bankers Association. So there are arguments about how to better extend and use regulation, but I think it's important to make that point.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And there's very, lending from one company to another is regulated, is under civil contract law. It's between two professional partners. It isn't regulated by the Financial Conduct Authority. The principles of regulation are either generally consumer protection or depositor protection if it's a bank, and neither of those apply to business lending or supply chain finance. What my question though really is, and one of the remits of our inquiry here at the Treasury Select Committee, is to learn if there are any lessons for financial regulation. And obviously you weren't the Chancellor directly responsible for financial regulation, but you ran a government that did a huge amounts of financial re-regulation. And from your involvement in this, are there, from your point of view and what you've learned, are there any lessons to be learned about financial regulations or suggested changes that you think the government should look at?
Well, I think I've listened to the evidence that you've had this week. I think the FCA made some very good points about the AR regime. I think the points Mr. Greensill made about credit insurance are important. I think what the FCA said about, even if there isn't greater regulation, having better information, not least so that you can see when something might become systemically important. I thought that was important. I just make one point as you do it, which is we must continue, if we can in this country, to be a financial tech a technological innovator. I mean, look, okay, this business failed, so perhaps this is not the right time to make this point, but there's a lot of innovation that's taking place that are taking things that banks tended to do quite badly and making it cheaper and more effective for our constituents. And I'd take the example, for instance, of remittances. We've all got many constituents who work very hard and send some of the money home to families in other countries. You know, for years they've faced high charges and poor service, and now technology, blockchain and other mechanisms and companies like Revolut and Monzo and all the rest of it are making that much easier. Now that's a great thing. So as we regulate better, let's not lose the ability of technology and capital markets to deliver low-cost finance for people who can really benefit.
Yeah, no, I certainly support that. And I should declare that since I left the British Bank Association, I've also been involved in financial technology firms, quite a few of them, and invested and indeed been an actual legal director of some. My one question, if you have described Greensill as a fintech firm, and one thing I've learned from my involvement in fintech is that it's quite an appealing phrase, and lots of people describe companies as fintech without them really having any tech there. And in particular, lots of people use the words artificial intelligence in a very sort of slapdash way, when there's nothing that intelligent about it in terms of technology. I was just wondering, how much did you look at the technology of Greensill? Because again, there've been quite a lot of reports of people lifting up the bonnet there. It had no sort of proprietary platform itself. There was nothing really that sophisticated about the technology.
I certainly wouldn't pretend to be an expert in this, but it seemed to me what Greensill were doing with partners like Oracle or Taulia or Textura in the past, using the information in a company's ERP to make sure you could extend credit to suppliers and indeed to employees faster. I think that does qualify for fintech, because the fin is the access to the deep capital markets, and the tech is using the ERP to make credit decisions better and faster. And I know that sounds all very techy, but ultimately what it can be about is trying to, make the cost of your mobile phone lower, making sure you can access your pay on a daily basis rather than waiting till the end of the month. I think these are quite powerful changes. So whether you want to call it tech enabled or fintech, that's a matter of choice, but it's certainly using technology and capital markets to make people's lives better.
My last question is about your communication with the Treasury. You obviously made various explanations about exactly what Greensill did. There is, as we said at the beginning, as you recognise, serious questions about the potential for fraud there, and the business model not being all that it seemed. And certainly, you've seen Lord Minor's evidence about that. How much did you check what you were telling the Treasury was actually fully true, and that are you satisfied that you made all the right inquiries to make sure that you as a former Prime Minister were not passing on any false information to the Treasury?
Well, that's a very good question. The briefing note that I sent, and many of the emails and text messages was sending the same briefing note to different people. That was drawn up in consultation with people at Greensill, and I asked that it was very carefully checked and that all the information in it was right, and I believe that to be the case.
And did you challenge any of the information at all, or did they provide you with the sort of pro forma?
I think it went through a number of drafts from memory. I'd have to check that, but that was the point. I thought we had a strong case. I wanted to make sure we didn't overstate anything. As I say, I think we did make a mistake in that. Here was the CCFF, here was our proposal to enter into it, and we took too many iterations to get to something that was really tailored to UK SMEs, sterling currency only, qualifying companies. We should have got there faster, and that is, I was frustrated about that, and that's a regret, and that did mean there was more contact than there otherwise should have been.
And my last question, Felicity Buchan asked you whether you regretted it, and you slightly sidestepped onto that in a direct way. If you're in the same situation again, what exactly would you do differently, or would you do exactly the same again?
Well, the first thing is, if you work for a company that goes into administration, you look back and think, could I have made a different choice? I did do due diligence, I did ask people, and all the rest of it, but it is a very depressing experience working for a company that goes into administration, and all the regret about the people who've lost their jobs and all the rest of it. So that obviously is something you'd think about. In terms of the contact with government ministers, I've said many times, you know, ex-prime ministers are different, and a letter or an email once is better. We were in special, I mean, what I'm saying to the committee is I think we were in very special circumstances, and that explains why I did what I did. But as I say, there are lessons to learn, and I'm sure your committee will perhaps give me some other ones to learn too.
Can I just push you on that one point? Apart from sending a single letter or a single email rather than the volume of communication you had, is there anything else you would have done differently throughout this episode?
Well, also getting to a better answer to how to amend the CCFF faster. I think that is, you know, as I've said, that was something we could have done better. Also, I think, look, when the company went into administration, you know, I waited quite a while before making a 1,700 word statement or whatever it was. I thought I was not the right person to go out and explain why the company had gone into administration, because I wasn't running the company and I wasn't a director. But I think the expectation that someone else would take that up and was perhaps something I might do differently.
Okay, thank you very much for your answers.
Thank you, Anthony. I'm just going to go back to Angela, please.
Thank you very much. Mr. Cameron, have you got anything to say to those who've lost money, who invested in the funds in Credit Suisse, those small German towns whose townships have lost a lot of money because of the what's happened at Greensill Bank? Do you have anything to say to them now? Well,
I do have. Obviously, it's a great regret that this company has failed, that it went into administration. You know, and the people I feel most sorry for are the people who work for Greensill, many of them at the HQ in Warrington, who worked very hard, who believed deeply in what the company was doing and have lost their jobs. And of course, if anyone does lose money through their investments, that's a matter of regret. My understanding is with the funds is it takes time for the assets to run off because a lot of them are receivables. And if the underlying company is still paying their suppliers and therefore paying back the funds, that money will be recovered. So I think it will take some time before we know what exactly the consequences are. But obviously, I'm extremely sorry for anyone who's lost money or lost out or lost a job because of what has happened.
And Mr. Cameron, what about the 5,000 workers who work at Liberty Steel, whose future is once more in doubt? And what about all of us taxpayers who subsidise the British business banks' loans, which also are likely to be irrecoverable as a result of this collapse?
Well, obviously, I'm very keen for Britain to continue to have a steel industry. As Prime Minister, I got very involved in the issues about Port Talbot and about Scunthorpe. And, you know, we're a great industrial nation. I hope we can maintain parts of our steel industry. And for all the concerns I have about the concentration on Gupta and GFG, you know, the idea of a green steel industry where we melt down more of our own scrap rather than export it and try to build a steel industry on that basis is something that I think has merit. So I hope that those steel jobs can be maintained. I think, look, perhaps your committee can help us get to the bottom of it, but I think it wouldn't be fair to say, well, it's the failure of Greensill that is putting GFG in jeopardy. It's a symbiotic relationship that obviously went wrong between the two. I'm, you know, let all steel jobs that can be saved, I hope they can be.
And Lord Macpherson, in his evidence to us, told us that the phrase he used with typical understatement, because I know him well too, is it is slightly disappointing that officials' time was wasted when that was a valuable commodity because of the wider crisis. Did you give enough thought to what the Treasury was having to deal with before or during or after you were generating your 56 messages?
Well, of course, I did think about this before calling the Treasury, and you know, I read Nick Macpherson's evidence, but I also, as I say, would draw your attention to the current serving permanent secretary and deputy permanent secretary who said that they didn't feel under pressure, they didn't feel it was inappropriate use of resources. I think it is a genuine question about, we know that the banks have excellent access to the Treasury, and quite right too, but when a lot of lending is carried out by non-bank financial institutions and by fintech firms, I think it's important that the Treasury, the Bank of England, understand how those work and how they could be included in schemes.
So summing that up, it's really no regrets then about your own personal behaviour?
I'm not saying that at all. I think I've said very clearly that, ex-prime ministers are different. I've reflected on all that's happened. I think there were very special circumstances in the crisis, the potential economic crisis that followed COVID. But, in future, I accept that, ex-prime ministers in their different position should restrict themselves to a single letter to make the points that they might want to make. I mean, hopefully there won't be any of those, but it was a particular time.
Chair, thank you very much.
Okay, thanks very much. David, can I just come back to one point, which is gnawing away at me a little bit? I think the intention is that what somebody is paid or what financial incentive arrangement they may be on is not relevant when it comes to how motivated they are or what the motivation is. I think most people would struggle with that idea, and I would accept that if these are small amounts, then you're probably right. But if they're very large amounts, then it's hard to argue, I think, that they wouldn't have some bearing for certainly most people as to how they would behave under those circumstances. So could I just press you just a little bit harder on this basic salary that you were on with Greensill? I mean, are we talking about something, say, up to $1 million or over $1 million, or can you give us some kind of feel? Because if it's a relatively small amount, then fine. But
it was a generous, big salary that you might earn at someone in my position at a bank or what have you. And the reason for, if you're being stubborn in pursuing me, I'm being stubborn in my responses. I do think it's important for people to know there was a economic interest, absolutely, both in pay, in cash, and in shares. But the questions you're asking and answering, I don't think require to know the exact figures. But yes, it was a generous salary.
But generous salary could cover a lot of possibilities, couldn't it? I mean, can't you give us something a little bit more specific than that?
Well, I think, as I've said, if I had gone to work for a large bank or such like, as some of my predecessors have done, perhaps it would have been even more. But I didn't want to go and work for a large bank. I was excited by working for a UK fintech firm. But as I say, in anyone's terms, it was a generous salary.
Okay. Could I go to Steve, please?
Thank you, Chair. And I refer to my registered shareholding in GlimpPay, which I do because we may return to fintech. Mr. Cameron, could I just ask you to explain, perhaps you might like to refer to pharmacies, why you were so keen on supply chain finance?
I was keen on it for a very simple reason. Maybe the way to do it is to go back to 2012 when Lex Greensill produced this scheme in government. We were in a credit crunch and he assembled a whole team of UK corporates who had agreed to pay their suppliers, to get their suppliers paid early and use supply chain finance, effectively extending their credit terms, because they can borrow money very cheaply, to all the companies right down in their supply chain. And it was this combination of using capital markets and technology to help small businesses get their bills paid on time that I saw as not just a good economic measure, but a socially useful measure. And that was one of the things that attracted me to working for the business.
So when Mr. Greensill gave us evidence, he particularly talked about the technology and machine learning when I pressed him. What's your understanding about the extent to which those future prescriptions were certain?
Well, if you take the NHS example, so to start with, my understanding is the first scheme was literally, instead of the pharmacy waiting 30 or 40 days for the NHS to cough up the money, as soon as they had the invoice approved, they could get the money from, at that stage, Citibank. So that was classic receivables finance. What changed with the new scheme was that an algorithm was being used to help predict the prescription behavior of each chemist, and so they could get the money in advance of actually making the prescriptions.
Yeah.
Now, this was incredibly popular with pharmacies. I mean, a lot of them saw their cost of capital plummet. They saw cash flows to their business improve, and it was a very successful scheme. Now, I wouldn't overdo the extent of machine learning and artificial intelligence. I mean, it's fairly predictable if you think of the pharmacies in, is it High Wycombe?
Wycombe, yeah.
Wycombe. You have a regular bunch of customers with regular prescriptions, so it's quite easy to predict. But that was the use of some artificial intelligence, some algorithm to predict it. I wouldn't overdo it, but that is a future receivable, and people getting paid for it early.
But how much was that market, for want of a better term, worth?
I don't have the figures, and I don't want to give a misleading figure. I mean, I think we're talking hundreds of millions, because I think it was somewhere towards 20% of NHS pharmacies that were using it. So, I mean, for instance, I can read here, one pharmacy said to us that we were reducing their annual charges from £7,000 to £400. So replacing, old-fashioned bank finance with supply chain finance was meaningful for these pharmacies. And also, Lex Greensill explained, probably saved the NHS £100 million a year too.
I'm just referring to a Times article of the 27th of March, which suggests in a paragraph connecting a meeting between Lex Greensill and Richard Douglas at the Department of Health. But in that paragraph, it connects it with a figure of 10 billion a year. I think the point I'm making here really is that these are very large sums of money involved when the public sector is really getting stuck into supply chain finance, aren't they?
They are big figures, and it does lead to this whole question, why do you need an outside body to do it? Why can't the NHS just pay faster? Which I think is probably something the PAC might come on to when they talk to me later on. But I think that is really worth answering, because the truth is two things. One is, there's a lot of bureaucracy in government, and even with the best will in the world, sometimes the early payment just simply doesn't happen, point one. And point two, I think Nick Macpherson in his evidence to you was very clear about this. He said, although the Treasury is in favour of it in theory, in practice, early payment means the Treasury borrowing more money and paying more interest on it. And so there is a cost. And I think what is useful about using supply chain finance, even in the public sector, is, of course, if you're paying big suppliers, early, they are paying for the benefit of that rather than the taxpayer. So I think it'd be sad to sort of rule out supply chain finance in the public sector, because I think it can be very helpful for small businesses like pharmacies, and it can actually save money for the government at the same time.
So those of us who've been involved with running businesses will know that it's common practice for a board to just work out strategically what the potential size of their business could be, what the size of their customer base and their market could be. What was your estimate? What was the board's estimate of the potential size of this supply chain finance market within government?
I don't have the figures for within government. I mean, the point I'd make is, while there were lots of ideas in government, actually only one, the NHS pharmacy scheme, actually happened. So I'm sure you could ask Greensill itself or a consultant to give you an estimate. I'm sure there are lots of potential uses, but they have to be properly tested to make sure they're value for money, and only one has actually happened, in my view. What the overall size of the market could be elsewhere is, as you know, having run a business, working capital globally is an enormous number, and if supply chain finance can provide more working capital solutions, there's a very big addressable market.
But there was a point in my briefing pack, I can't quite find it here, but there was an account in the press of Jeremy Haywood making introductions at the MOD for Lex Greensill, suggesting that no stone should be unturned in terms of applying supply chain finance to the MOD's spending. Do you recognise that as having taken place?
I don't know. I mean, look, Lex Greensill was brought into government by Jeremy, as I said in my statement, to help solve an important problem. And my understanding is lots of ideas were looked at, including the MOD. The only one that actually came off, because I think it had such a good working case, was NHS pharmacies. but I'm sure lots of other things were looked at. I think, look, Jeremy, I mean, it's he's been attacked about some of these things, which I don't think is fair. He's not here to defend himself. He was an outstanding civil servant, and he was wanted to bring good people in to try and shake things up and deliver good public services. And it's important to put that on the record.
So when the board was considering the size of its market, did it think that it might end up applying supply chain finance to 1 billion, 10 billion, 100 billion of government spending?
Well, the total amount of credit extended by Greensill in last year was 140 billion. That was around the world, taking in whatever it is, 150 countries. In government, it was simply this NHS pharmacy scheme, and I can give you the figure for that. I don't think, I mean, if you look at the planned expansion of Greensill, government provision wasn't a huge part of it. It was really winning the big corporate clients all over the world.
Yeah.
And that was the biggest focus for the business.
So what I'm driving at here is, by the time you're using this method with government, you're using it with people's salaries. You've referred to the Earned app. The potential size of this business was hundreds and hundreds of billions of pounds, wasn't it?
Yes, but remember that the fight, if you take the $143 billion, actually not pounds, I mean, that is mostly funded through intermediaries, through the Credit Suisse funds or through banks or what have you. So the financial capacity to deliver that, particularly, something that is low risk, such as, I mean, I was a passionate fan of the Earned app, because you and I know there are lots of people in our public sector who access payday lending or other forms of credit that cost them a lot of money, and it'd be much better if they could draw down their salary as they earn it. Now, of course, if you finance something like that, the risks are very low, because the chance of the NHS not paying its wages or not paying wages are very low. So I'm sorry, I'm giving you long answers, but you can.
No, that's okay. So to turn back to the COVID corporate finance facility at the Bank of England, where does that money come from when the Bank of England issues it through that facility?
Well, the bank was acting on the Treasury's behalf. I don't. I mean, I think it's a Bank of England facility that, of course, is there to buy commercial paper, and that is an asset. And obviously, if those companies continue to succeed, then the costs of that purchase will be relatively low.
Well, in the jargon, it's financed by reserves, which of course means it's new money. The COVID corporate finance facility, as people will find online, is new money coming into existence. So wasn't the proposition that you were making, I know you know that I've got a big interest.
I remember a conversation we had about base money creation and your view.
Yes, but let's not get into it now, because I'm running out of time. But the point I'm making is that when you were arguing that Greensill should use the COVID corporate finance facility, what you were effectively doing, I think, was arguing that these securitizations should take advantage of the Bank of England's money creation. Isn't that right?
Look, it is a very important point. Greensill at no point was asking for a loan or for a bailout or for direct government support. That is not what was happening. What we do, or what we did, was, go to Vodafone and say, we'll pay your suppliers early, you pay us in 60 or 90 days, create a bond based around that. And if the CCFF had invested in bonds like that, that would have been money directly into Vodafone's supply base and other British companies' supply bases. That's what these things are. So they're quite like commercial paper.
Now, finally, I feel I must, with regret, I must ask you a delicate question, because I feel if I don't ask it, it will be asked elsewhere. Were you at any point while you were Prime Minister directly advised by Lex Greensill on the issue of supply chain finance? And in the course of those conversations, at any stage, did he intimate that subsequently you might end up working for Greensill?
Well, the answer to the first question is he worked in Downing Street. He produced this one initiative, which was a combination of private sector firms signing up to do supply chain finance and the NHS pharmacy scheme. That came to me from civil servants in the proper way, but I think it was largely his work. And we announced that in October 2012. And as far as I was concerned, that was a successful scheme. I think I met him twice while I was in Downing Street, and I can absolutely confirm at no stage did he ever suggest that I would go and work with him or for him afterwards. That happened after I left office, and I think that's a very important point.
Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Steve. And Rationale, please.
Thank you. Mr. Cameron, Eid Mubarak. I'm spending my afternoon with you instead of my family, and I'm looking forward to finishing and joining them. We've established that Mr. Sanjeev Gupta was a major customer of Greensill. Did you know how much money was being loaned to Mr. Gupta's metal empire GFG Alliance? Yes.
I don't have the exact figures. As I say, I wasn't involved in the credit committee. I wasn't responsible for extending credit, so I wasn't responsible for those decisions. So I don't have a exact figure for you.
The question was, did you know how much money was being loaned out to Gupta's metal empire?
No, I don't have that figure.
You didn't know? You didn't know?
I knew that GLG was a significant customer of Greensill. I knew there was an issue about client concentration. I asked questions about that. I was reassured there was a plan to deal with that. And I think that's one of the important reasons for this business not succeeding.
The Financial Times article in 2018 spoke about the Greensill link and described it as financial alchemy. And yet you talked earlier about doing the due diligence, and it seems like for someone who ran our country, that perhaps that due diligence didn't serve you well ultimately. I'm going to move on to another question. We established in the earlier comments and also the evidence you've submitted that you lobbied the Chancellor. You also lobbied the then Business Minister Nadeem Zahawi in June 2020. His department is responsible for the British Business Bank. And our understanding is that you are pressing for a maximum loan to Greensill that could be made under the Treasury's coronavirus large business interruption loan scheme, which was increased ultimately from 50 million to 200 million, and that was crucial. And so could we infer from what ultimately happened, which is that 8 times 50 million pounds of loans were split, and Mr. Greensill's company were able to then give that loan to GFG linked companies, that lobbying effort, that intensive lobbying effort ultimately did pay off?
No, I wouldn't say that at all, because the Greensill approached, as I understand it, the British Business Bank to be accredited as a lender under these schemes, something which I had absolutely no involvement with. And it was accredited, as I think were some other fintech firms, not just traditional banks. So that was a successful approach. When Greensill asked to be raised to the higher level, that was ultimately rejected, I think, by the British Business Bank and by the Treasury. So no, I wouldn't agree with that formulation at all.
Okay, so did you, can I just check, did you discuss the British Business Bank as a possible route to getting funding for Greensill at your meeting with the Bank of England?
I don't believe I did. As I say, I wasn't at all involved until the moment of asking whether it could go up to the higher level in the British Business Bank accreditation process. My involvement with the Bank of England and the Treasury was all about the CCFF, because that was where I think we were most enthusiastic about having a product that we thought was even better than what they were suggesting and fitted in quite well.
And did you have, so you're pretty confident that you didn't discuss the other scheme, the CLBILS scheme, with the bank? What about, did you have any discussions with Nigel Boardman, who was a non-executive board member of the...
I must qualify something. Of course, Richard Sharp, I did have there's an email, text exchange in there. Richard Sharp, he wasn't at the bank at that stage, he was at the Treasury, but just make that point. Sorry, your question about Nigel Boardman.
Yes. Did you have any discussions about the British Business Bank as a possible route to getting funding with Nigel Boardman? Have you had any conversation with him in the last couple of years? He was, after all, the exec board member, and also he's leading the inquiry that the current Prime Minister has announced.
I haven't got any record of conversations with him in the last 2 years. I can double check that. I certainly haven't discussed any of these issues with him, but I'm going to take part in his inquiry. Okay. I think I'm seeing him next week.
I hope you'll understand why I'm asking these questions, because there's a very cozy relationship between people in power, or people who have been in power like yourself, and what we have, as you've heard, is the spectre of £1 billion, as Lord Miners pointed out and others have pointed out, of public money potentially, certainly be at stake, in 3 to 5 billion lost to the taxpayer. And what we've heard today, you're suggesting that frankly, it feels like you're not taking responsibility for what's happened. I just want to come back to this point about Mr. Greensill. When he gave evidence on Tuesday, I asked the question about the loans to Mr. Gupta's companies. Can you just confirm for me the press reports that Greensill loaned a total of 400 million in the CLBILS loans to GFG linked companies, and that they were split across 8 loans of 50 million?
I don't have that information. As I say, I wasn't involved in any of those lending decisions, so I don't have that information and can't confirm that.
Right. So you don't know. You don't know.
Not for certain, no.
I mean, as a former Prime Minister, it seems like you either conveniently turned a blind eye on things, or you didn't do the due diligence properly, or you didn't have proper oversight, and your reputation is now in tatters, Mr. Cameron.
Well, I was an advisor to the company, and I thought I could help the company with some important tasks that included its international expansion and winning customers and working with partners. But I wasn't involved in lending decisions. I wasn't a director. I wasn't on the credit or risk committees. And I think that, that is a perfectly good way of working with a business. You're not responsible for the day-to-day decisions. You're not responsible for the lending decisions, but nonetheless, you're working with the team to try and help them expand the business. I talked about the due diligence that I did before joining the company. Obviously, I greatly regret this company's gone into administration, and there are lessons to learn from that, which I'm sure your committee are going to help us all to learn.
But the issue here is that Mr. Greensill's company did find a way of circumventing the 50 million cap, and ultimately 400 million pounds worth of government taxpayer-funded loans were made available to Gupta. And you know very well the risks to steel workers, thousands of them, and the wider impact on people and the taxpayer. Should you not take some responsibility for what's happened? Because it seems like, we're gonna, well, you're famously known as Teflon Man, you're very, you're a great survivor, and no one's taking responsibility, and yet taxpayers are going to be already affected, and they're going to continue to be affected by this.
Well, of course, I take responsibility for my decision to work with this business. I take responsibility for the decisions I made with respect to contacting the government for all of those things. As I said to you, I hope that these steel jobs survive. I'm not clear about, I watched Paul Miner's evidence about this cost to the taxpayer. I really think, your committee will be able to ask the Treasury for an accurate breakdown of what these costs should be, because we haven't, I think, seen those.
But at the very least, it's 400, with respect, at the very least, it will be 400 million at the very conservative estimate, because those are the loans.
Well, I think the difficulty is that, it is a criticism of Greensill that it was overexposed to Gupta and lent too much money to Gupta. But if you're saying that, it's hard to say at the same time that it wasn't trying to support jobs in the steel industry. I think perhaps the problem is there needed to be more skepticism from Greensill about Gupta and what was happening, rather than believing that actually the vision would be turned to reality. But we're getting a bit beyond our brief. But I think it's going to be a while before we know how this works out. But I hope we'll be able to have as many steel jobs in this country as we possibly can.
I think what I'm trying to establish is what I'm trying to understand is what the actual overall impact has been. You've been given a very hard time about the lobbying operation, and I would say that from ultimately from what happened, your association with Greensill and the lobbying operation that took place did actually in the end benefit the company that you were working with.
I don't follow that argument, I'm afraid, because what we were asking for, an extension of the CCFF to include supply chain finance, didn't happen. The Greensill's accreditation with the British Business Bank didn't involve any lobbying at all. It was Greensill going through the accreditation process. And like some other fintech companies, it was accredited as a C-bills lender. So the argument you're making, I don't follow, because actually ultimately the lobbying effort was unsuccessful. The Treasury gave good reasons for that, as I said in my evidence earlier.
And the Treasury also announced this new scheme. It was the Treasury Department, not BIS, not the British Business Bank, which was the CLBLS scheme. So anyway, the point here is that this company ultimately did manage to access, through these 8 different £50 million loans, access loans, which were then provided to companies associated with Mr. Gupta, which has left the taxpayer short. I mean, can I just say that having listened to the evidence session and your response, I think what people will be really, really deeply concerned and alarmed about is that how you allowed, frankly, someone who was, using you here, either at best he was using you, Mr. Greensill, and at worst, well, frankly, exploiting your reputation and bringing the office of the former Prime Minister into disrepute. And you kind of went along with it. You played along, and you should have been much, much more careful about the due diligence, and you turned a blind eye on things that were blindingly obvious.
Well, obviously, I take a different view, which is that I chose to work for Greensill because I thought it had a good core product in extending credit and early payment to small firms in our country. I believe that could be expanded with huge benefit. I believe that this could have been a UK fintech success story. Now, very sadly, that hasn't happened to be the case, but I did do due diligence. I did look at the board. I did look at the arrangements the company had in place. But obviously, I deeply regret that this company has failed, and that has consequences.
Yeah, and huge consequences. And I think, as those of us who've worked with you, it's bitterly disappointing. And frankly, this particular scandal is a huge, its reputation is so damaging to our democracy because of the office you held. But it's damaging in terms of real consequences to real people's lives.
Well, the point I would make is actually in our country, for all that I think we can improve transparency and rules around lobbying and everything else, is people can see when businesses meet with the government. We know that. In lots of countries we don't know that. And before I became Prime Minister, no one had any idea who was meeting with government. That is transparent. We have a lobbying act, so multi-client lobbyists have to declare who they lobby on behalf of. Of course, there's more we can do to improve these systems, but ultimately, a company I work with made a suggestion to the government turned it down, and the civil servants, I think, behaved impeccably throughout and have explained that what was done was perfectly appropriate and a sensible set of conversations were gone into. So I take a sort of different view about how this happened. The sad thing is that the company itself has now failed and jobs have been lost, and that has real world consequences.
But I put it to you, Mr. Cameron, that what happened, and this was, don't forget, at a time when the government was dealing with public procurement contracts. You know, we now know that there was a separate VIP lane for government contracts, and your intense lobbying as a former prime minister made it very uncomfortable for ministers and for officials. And in the end, what I put to you is that yes, the Treasury and others said no to you politely, but they found another route for you, which was through the British Business Bank and through the department, and that allowed. And if you look at the chronology of the announcements and that was made, that where the coronavirus large business interruption loan was introduced, it was done after that intensive lobbying. And I put it to you that actually you were successful ultimately in making sure that that company did benefit. And that this stuff smacks of favoritism and power. Those in power, like yourself, with powerful connections and relationships, getting access to decision makers and having that access to the VIP lane, the fast lane, into what you want. And that is fundamentally damaging to our democracy, and it puts the civil service, the impartial nature of our civil service, at a in a very difficult position. And you should have known better, Mr. Cameron, not because of the thing you've said about lobbying. You were the architect of the Lobbying Act. You should have known better. And frankly, it's bitterly disappointing. And frankly, I have no pleasure in having to sit in this meeting with the former Prime Minister. Okay, you were, in your own words, you were the future once. I have no pleasure in being in this situation, sitting in front of you, and for the country to see the former Prime Minister being used in this way by, frankly, somebody who was close to, who was frankly acting like a con artist.
I just perhaps make one point on the application to the British Business Bank. I mean, I do believe that was a separate application process in which the Treasury wasn't involved, but it's a very good question for your committee to take up with the Treasury about whether that was a separate application process. I believe it was, but that might be one outcome of this conversation.
For announcing it, I'm very grateful to your time. I'm simply saying it's deeply disappointing, and I hope out of this episode and out of that experience that you've had, that we can make sure that no Prime Minister is ever caught up in a scandal of this nature, because it's bad for our democracy, it's bad for our impartial civil service. You will never be disassociated from the office of Prime Minister around the world. And even though you're not from my party, I have huge respect for the position of Prime Minister and a former Prime Minister, and it's bitterly disappointing what's happened. This whole episode is appalling for our country and our democracy.
Right. David, unless you had anything further to say, I think that brings us to the end of this session. It's been a very difficult session, I think, for you, David, in a number of different ways. And undoubtedly, the committee has been robust and in some cases extremely robust with you. However, we are a courteous committee. We do very much appreciate you having appeared before us today. And I know you will have found it difficult in part, but you did stand up and be counted and come and sit in front of this committee and take our questions. And for that, we are grateful. And that concludes this session. Order. Okay, thanks very much.
The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has